Okay. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome to this, our third lecture of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland Dante Public Lecture Series, and you're in for a real treat, I think, this evening. I know we are competing with various things this evening, not least Valentine's Day. So I'm sure our speaker will talk about love in Dante at some point or in some form. But it does give me really genuine great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Theodore J. Cachey Jr. to give him his full title from the University of Notre Dame. Ted, as most of you know, is Fabiano Collegiate Professor of Italian and Raverino Family Director of the Center for Italian Studies at the Devers program in Dante Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in Italian medieval and Renaissance literature, in particular Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarca. The history of the Italian language and the literature and the history of travel. He's authored or edited several books, including Le Isole Fortunate, Appunti di Storia Letteraria Italiana from 1994, Pigafetta's First Voyage Around the World in 95, and then a revised edition 2007. Dante Now, Current Trends in Dante Studies from 95, Petrarch's Guide to the Holy Land in 2002, and Le Culture di Dante in 2004, and also the wonderful Dante and Petrarch, Anti-Dantism, Metaphysics and Tradition from 2009 that he edited with Zygranski, as well as many other essays and book chapters in Italianistica, Belfagor, and many other riviste. He's the founder and co-editor with Zygranski and Christian Mohs of the William and Catherine Devers series in Dante Studies, and the director and editor-in-chief of the Le Tre Corone, Rivista Internazionale di Studi su Dante, Petrarca, Boccaccio. And I just want to, he is all of these things, yes, but there is also this wonderful book coming out later on this year in May, with contributions from some of the world's leading Dante specialists, including Manuele Gragnolati, Christopher Klein-Hens, Zig, Claire Honus, Simon Gilson, Mirko Tavoni, Ted himself, David Lummis, Luca Bianchi, and Vittorio Montemaggi. And many of those names will be familiar to you from lectures that have been given in this series over the years. So just before we begin tonight, I'd ask everybody to, except for Ted, to switch off your cameras and your mics. There will be quite time for question at the end. Ted's lecture tonight is deliciously titled Rumb Lines Mapping Dante in the Early Other Works. Ted, a te la parola.
Thank you. I'm just putting this up. Thanks for the kind introduction and the promotion of the Dante's other works that we're looking forward to seeing in print, and for the invitation to present some research in this prestigious University College Cork Dante public lecture series. I joined several of the lectures last year, as well as Adoyo's fascinating presentation last week. And I'm looking forward to the talks in the remainder of the series this year. So it's a real treat for me to be able to present some work in progress here this evening. I'd also like to recognize and thank Dara for the collaboration we're developing between our respective centers at Notre Dame and at Cork, which is based on a commitment to Dante studies, but also to Italian studies in the modern and contemporary period, and to the formation of graduate students and as well as postdoctoral fellows. My talk is taken from the draft of a chapter 2 of a larger project called Mapping Dante, Exile, Cosmology, and Cartographic Writing. Mapping Dante is about the way that Dante maps the cosmos and himself within it as a means of transcending the experience of exile. The first chapter, Legend, provides a guide for reading the book. It starts by establishing the connection between cartography and exile, and by describing the sources and the nature of Dante's cartographic impulse and ethos. Chapter 2, Rumb lines, from which the bit I'll present today is taken, charts the general parameters as well as the trajectory of the cosmological theme as it develops in the works Dante wrote before the Commedia. Chapter 3, Imago Mundi, undertakes to give an account of the picture of the cosmos that Dante developed in the context of the evolving cosmological thought of his time. Chapter 4, Mappa Mundi, undertakes to offer a cartographic reading of the Commedia. Writing a cosmological poem offered Dante a solution to the problem of exile by allowing him to establish the poem as an alternative universe, that is, a space in which to remap the world from the perspective of exile and to effectively achieve mastery over the turbulent world of history and his own personal history as it unfolded. The poem recasts the cosmos as a kind of self-made map. The exile's wanderings through Italy are transformed into a pilgrimage de reditu in unum, whereby, for example, the kaleidoscopic mappings of the Italian cities of Inferno gives way to the Purgatorio's penitential progress through the peninsula before advancing to the transcendent reterritorializations of Italy in the Paradiso. Like the cartouche in cartography, a design feature that accompanies a map bearing the signature of the map maker, the final chapter of Mapping Dante, Cartouche, considers the late other works as a kind of signature appended to the Mappa Mundi of the poem, a compact constellation of texts accompanying and trailing the Commedia, each in its own way, reflecting upon and reinforcing the poet's investments in the picture of the cosmos and his place within it as figured in the poem. So, Rumb lines, mapping Dante and the early other works. The map is based on a persuasive attempt. The rigorous geometry of Rumb lines expresses the promise of attaining one's destination, the ocean's opposite shore, well before having even left the port. Christian Jacob in The Sovereign Map, a wonderful book, by the way. Dante turned to cosmology for the first time in his works in the Vita Nova to describe the divinely ordained appearance of Beatrice in his life at the end of his 9th year. He located himself on the map of the cosmos, situating the decisive encounter of his life in relation to the girazione of the 4th heaven of the sun and to the counter movement of the 8th heaven of the fixed stars. Nove fiate già appresso lo mio nascimento, era tornato lo cielo della luce quasi a uno medesimo punto, quanto alla sua propria girazione, quando ai miei occhi apparve prima la gloriosa donna della mia mente, la quale fu chiamata da molti Beatrice, i quali non sapevano che si chiamare. Ella era in questa vita già stata tanto che nello suo tempo lo cielo stellato era mosso verso la parte d'oriente delle 12 parti, l'una di un grado, sì che quasi dal principio del suo anno nono apparve a me e io la vidi quasi dalla fine del mio nono. Dante synchronized the first apparition of the Donna della mia mente with the movement of the heavens, describing it as a cosmic event in its own right. Agli miei occhi apparve, io la vidi. He creates a cosmological frame of reference in terms of two movements, that of lo cielo della luce, the heaven of light, the sun along the ecliptic, and that of the lo cielo stellato, the heaven of the fixed stars, that is the planets of the zodiac from west to east. The 8th heaven of the fixed stars was believed to move from west to east 1 degree in 100 years, or 1/12 of a degree in 8 years and 4 months, a phenomenon now known as precession of the equinoxes. The two sentences represent the auspicious beginning of Dante's cosmographic poetics, both for their content and for the way the language mirrors the opposed yet complementary movements of the heavenly bodies. For De Robertis, the passage had the function of a horoscope, heralding a propitious forecast for the literary enterprise. He called attention to its solemn rhetoric, marked by use of the classical cum inversum construction, according to which the logical relations of the two clauses are reversed. The sentences mirror one another, turning in on themselves like a circle closed off by the number 9. The cosmic-like inversion of the syntax imitates the slow and grandiose retrograde movement of the 8th heaven of the fixed stars with respect to the diurnal motion of the sun. By establishing astronomical coordinates as a frame of reference, Dante took the first step in map making of any kind, an inaugural gesture of mapping himself in the cosmos. Maps are first made in the sky, writes David Greenwood in his classic handbook, Mapping. And the first thing the map maker does is establish the fence or reference frame, the frame of the map. Dante was drawing Rumb lines, in other words, that implicitly expressed, according to Christian Jacob's phrase, the promise of attaining one's destination. In other words, the poet established at the beginning of the Vita Nova both the cosmological spatial parameters for the libello and the premise for their transcendence portrayed in the final poem, Oltre la sfera che più larga gira. The programmatic implications of the horoscope at the beginning of the Vita Nova can hardly be overestimated. They extend well beyond the libello, anticipating the cosmological poetics of the Rime Petrosa and the poem itself. The prophetic implications of the situation of the heavens at the time of Beatrice's conception, for instance, which took place around the time of Dante's birth, will be explicitly treated later in the Vita Nova, in a disposition on the providential arrangement of the 9 heavens of the Christianized Ptolemaic cosmos at Beatrice's conception in chapter 29. Sua generazione, tutti e 9 gli mobili cieli perfettissimamente si aveano insieme. It perhaps bears emphasizing, since commentators sometimes don't underscore this point, that Dante's birth is thereby made to coincide with the perfect disposition of the heavens that superintended Beatrice's generazione, by bringing together what we learn in chapter 29 with what we learn in chapter 2, namely that Dante was born between 8 and 9 months before Beatrice. It becomes apparent that the situation at the time of Dante's birth and Beatrice's conception respectively corresponded to an optimal celestial state. Maraldi has noted that the date of the encounter would have been between 21 May and 21 June of 1274 with the sun in Gemini. As Dante later writes in the Convivio, if the disposition of heaven, la quale si varia per le costellazioni che continuamente ti trasmutano, were brought into perfect harmony, and se tutte le precedenti virtudi s'accordassero sovra la produzione di un'anima nella loro ottima disposizione, tanto discenderebbe in quella della dietade che quasi sarebbe un altro Dio incarnato. Bruno Nardi judged the passage crucial for motivating Dante's prophetic calling. In any event, the cosmic foundations of Dante's subsequent project are established along their vertical axis for the first time in the Vita Nova, including a hyperbolic, in the literal sense, aspirational journey beyond the 9th heaven and therefore beyond space and time, as recounted in chapter 41. Now, my contention is that simply this prodigious epic inauguration at the start of the Vita Nova of Dante's mappings of the self and his cosmological poetics originated in response to the poet's traumatic, disorienting first experience of Beatrice. The event described in the 5th stanza of the canzone E mi cresce di me, in profoundly alienated terms, that have been taken as tantamount to the account of the experience of an epileptic seizure. Lo giorno che costei nel mondo venne, secondo che si trova nel libro della mente che vien meno, la mia persona pargola sostenne una passion nuova, tal ch'io rimasi di paura pieno, che a tutte mie virtù fu posto un freno, subitamente, sì, io caddi in terra, per una luce che nel cuor percosse, e se il libro non era, lo spirito maggior tremò sì forte, che parve ben che morte per lui in questo mondo giunta fosse, ma or ne incresce a quei che questo mosse. The radical divergence between the account of the poet's first encounter with Beatrice as given by the poem and as given by the libello has inspired what Teodolinda Barolini aptly characterized as scholarly anxiety. It even led some commentators to deny that the encounter described in E min cresce di me could ever have referred to Beatrice, at least until Michele Barbi settled the matter in a landmark study. The canzone is currently considered to be an early attempt of Dante's to organize and historicize his experience and his poetry, and as documenting a point of arrival in his development at the threshold of the Vita Nova, almost the scrigno, writes Marani, or dossier, from which the first part of the Vita Nova derives so many of its motifs. For Barolini, the fifth stanza of the canzone represents, I quote Barolini, essentially a trial run for the Vita Nova, which reveals the road traveled by Dante to Beatrice of the Vita Nova was far from overdetermined, end of quote. Barolini and others have tended to see the poem as alternative to the treatment of the Vita Nova, yet there's a developmental relation between them that seems clear enough. What is most striking and significant about the transition from the canzone to the Vita Nova is the explicit emergence of cosmology in response to the disorienting experience of Dante's initial encounter with Beatrice as described in E min cresce di me. At the start of the Vita Nova, we get the cosmocartographic reframing of the foundational event of Dante's literary life. Of course, the seeds for this development were already present in the canzone. Barolini has noted how E min cresce di me, in E min cresce di me, Dante, and I cite Barolini again, sets the whole drama in a cosmic and supernatural frame, end of quote. And for example, at the end of the fifth stanza, Dante's situation is pitied by he who set this world in motion, ma or ne incresce a quel che questo mondo mosse. God's compassion is inspired by the threat to Dante's life, a threat of existential exile, as described in the third stanza, which is focused for Barolini by the recurrence of the verb cacciare. Innamorata se ne va piangendo fuori di questa vita, la sconsolata che la caccia amore. And ivi si lamenta d'amor che fuor d'esto mondo la caccia. The spatio-physical aspect of the existential threat experienced by Dante at the appearance of Beatrice in his life is worth underscoring, as is the suitability and efficacy of the cosmocartographical response he subsequently fashioned. If Dante is threatened with being driven into exile d'esto mondo, if he's being driven off the map, so to speak, his characteristic response, starting from the Vita Nova, will be to reorient himself on the map of the cosmos by means of a procedure that is tantamount to remapping the world, including his place in it. At the origins of Dante's poetic identity, the appearance of Beatrice provokes a crisis of self, an experience of exile predating the political exile that went to the heart of the poet's sense of his place in the world. The encounter was a traumatic event from which he recovered by establishing his position in distinctively cosmographic terms. Indeed, at the beginning of the Vita Nova, Dante sets himself apart from lyric poets of the period for the way in which he relates cosmological phenomena to his personal situation. As Claudio Giunta observed in his commentary on Voi che intendendo il terzo cielo movete, Dante's originality consisted in the ability, I'm citing Giunta here, the ability that only he has among writers of his time to put into relation cosmology with the most important events of his private life, and to interpret these against the background of that cosmology. The introduction of a constructive cosmographic dimension in the poet's response to the appearance of Beatrice in his life and the transition from E mi cresce di me to the Vita Nova establishes a signature pattern that will indelibly imprint Dante's literature. It informs the later Rime, both before and after the exile, as well as the post-exilic Convivio and the De Vulgaria Eloquentia, at which point the geocartographical mapping of Italy is added to the poet's cosmographic repertoire. It will continue to characterize the deep structures and motivations behind the Commedia, impacting even the development of the late other works in relation to the poem. For example, the Questio de Acqua e Terra, a late career self-mapping in anxious response to the renewed pressures of exile, composed on the eve of the definitive move to Ravenna with the Paradiso still in progress. If you think about it, Dante is continually seeking to locate himself, to check and correct his course within a cosmocartographic frame of reference, perhaps most impressively in the astronomical check-ins of the Purgatorio. I'm here now writing this, but there I was. I'm teaching the Purgatorio now. I tell the students, it's so he doesn't lose his place. Dante sets himself against the background network of Rumb lines, if you will, on the journey of his life and works. The last of Dante's lyric poems, Amor da che vi convien, or La Montanina, which I treat at the end of this chapter, dedicated to Vita Nova and the Rime, from which I'm excerpting these remarks, renews and reformulates a cosmographic poetic response to the alienations of exile at the very threshold of the Commedia, a response whose genealogy can be traced back to the original experience of exile self-alienation of E mi cresce di me, and its resolution in the transition to the Vita Nova's exordial horoscope. But what are the origins or sources of this innovation that assumes such a central role in Dante's poetic development? I think the introduction of cosmology in Dante's work can be explained in both conceptual and historical contextual terms. And I'd like to try to start to give an account from these perspectives in the time that I have remaining. Folgorazione, stupor, wonder. By introducing the cosmological heavens at the beginning of the book, Dante established a macro-structural framework that will prove to be indispensable support not only for the libello, but for his subsequent intellectual and poetic development. Mapping the self within a cosmic frame makes it possible for Dante to gain perspective on the disorienting and negative experience of the Cavalcantian phase of his passion, to chart out or map and turn the Vita Nova's account of its supersession. In fact, the cosmographic framing at the beginning of the Vita Nova signals the fact that the poet has achieved the stability of perspective on the history of his love for La Donna della mia mente that was a necessary premise for undertaking to write the libello in the first place. Cosmology assumes an abiding role from that point forward in his works as a key form of knowledge, both as scientific knowledge of astrology, astronomy, and as poetry and myth-making. It was essential for the way that it contributed to and fostered the poet's greater stability and security, and represented an indispensable instrument utilized by the poet to negotiate his place in the world, enabling the prosecution of his literary project. It's no accident that the book of memory, which was failing in E mi cresce di me, nel libro della mente che viene meno, has fully recovered at the beginning of the Vita Nova. Now it can even serve as a vehicle sufficient to sustain the enterprise of a book in quella parte del libro della mia memoria. We are not far here from the ideal correspondence between book and cosmos of the Commedia, with the author Dante occupying a position at the intersection of the astrophysical cosmos and the metaphysical cosmos of the transcendent. From a conceptual point of view, how did Dante process the experience of the initial fulgurazione as described in E min cresce di me and Move Beyond It? In terms that are not completely alien to Dante's cultural context, what was the nature of this transition marked by the emergence of cosmology? We've seen how the encounter with Beatrice, by any measure and according to all accounts, the source of inspiration of Dante's literature, is initially experienced and represented in terms of a kind of exile, a loss of self, a threat to life, understood in terms of a banishment. Whether or not Dante was an epileptic, as Sant'Agata, among others, have suggested, it seems clear that he describes the experience of the trauma of that encounter in pathological terms, albeit not as absolutely bereft of redeeming cultural value. If it is true that in the medieval mind and in the subsequent tradition, the seizure of the epileptic could be associated with the fulgurazione and conversion of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, a powerful prototype that can be seen to inform the implementation of the theme of fulgurazione and loss of consciousness that has been recognized to be a signature theme of Dante's. It occurs at several points in his works, in the poem, for example, in Purgatorio 15, or even as far as the final vision of the poem, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne all'alta fantasia cui mancò possa. From this perspective, the Damascene moment of E min cresce di me is a point of departure for the Pauline theme of the intervention of God's grace running through Dante's works. But it also represents Dante's original experience of stupore maraviglia, which led to the pursuit of philosophical and poetic knowledge. In the transition from poem to book, Dante progressed beyond the trauma of the initial encounter described in terms of the fulgurazione of an epileptic seizure and loss of consciousness, and from a state of stupore to maraviglia. The pathological, albeit potentially sacred condition, is reinterpreted by Dante in the transition from poem to book as a point of departure for a pursuit of knowledge, precisely the response to the sense experience per alcuno modo sentire of marvelous things, maravigliose cose, as Dante described it in book 4 of the Convivio, che lo stupore è uno stordimento d'animo per grandi e meravigliose cose vedere o udire o per alcuno modo sentire, che in quanto paiono grandi fanno reverente a sé quelli che le sente, in quanto paiono mirabili fanno voglioso di sapere di quelle. Dante should be noted as defining stupore here in the context of a discussion of the virtues, good qualities, and laudable emotions that characterize the man who possesses true nobility of mind. Stupore is included in the survey as one of the elements making up the emotion of vergogna, or shamefastness, which should distinguish the noble man in his first age, or adolescentia, that is, during the time of life that would correspond to the period of Beatrice's first appearance in Dante's life, whether when he was 9 months old or 9 years old, since according to the Convivio, adolescence extends from 8 months to 25 years. It's widely noted by commentators that Dante's positive view of stupore distinguishes him from St. Thomas, who distinguished between admiratio and stupore, affirming that the first induces to inquiry while the latter blocks activity. For Thomas, stupor is philosophica considerationes impedimentum. Dante ignores this distinction, and in his discussion in the Convivio, seems to counter Thomas by his emphasis on stordimento d'animo, amazement, stupor of the mind. Boitani has noted in further characterizing Dante's distinctiveness on this point that in Dante's formulation, the use of the word animo, in stordimento d'animo, embraces the entire human person, both physically and psychologically. It describes, according to Boitani, what for Dante must have been a totalizing phenomenon of incredible power. It's in this totalizing physiological manifestation that Dante's stupore follows Albert the Great, who for Marjorie O'Rourke Boyle was the inventor, and I'm citing O'Boyle, the inventor of the conflation of philosophy and physiology and wonder. For example, in his definition of wonder in the Metaphysica, I quote, an agonia and suspension of the heart in insensibility at a great portent apparent to sense, thus so because the heart undergoes a systole. Therefore, the operation of wonder in an agonia and systole of the heart is from the suspension of desire toward knowing the cause of its portent that appears. Dante's departure from the authority of Aquinas on the point perhaps derives, on the one hand, from the dramatic personal circumstances of the first appearance of Beatrice in his life. Perhaps he was an epileptic, and what will become a signature theme in his literature, the shock of wonder, had its origins in a personal pathology from which derived his special authority in the matter. This is basically Sant'Agata's novelistic point of view, but it could be. In any event, it must have been a physical and psychological event of incredible power, according to A. Mincresce di Me, with a positive outcome from the perspective of Albert the Great, for the experience instilled in the poet both reverence and a yearning for knowledge. Indeed, it's the second part of Dante's definition that stupore at great and marvelous things can instill reverence for them in him who perceives them and make him yearn for knowledge that bears special significance for the transition from poem to book, in which cosmology originally emerged in Dante's discourse of Beatrice. For standing behind Dante's definition of wonder in the Convivio was a passage from the second chapter of the Metaphysics, which was the locus classicus for locating the origin of the birth of thought and wonder, at the origins of both philosophy and myth, including the arts, and among the arts, poetry, first and foremost. Dante references it several times in his works. It is through wonder that men now begin and originally began to philosophize, wondering in the first place at obvious perplexities, and then by gradual progression, raising questions about greater matters too, about the changes of the moon and of the sun, about the stars, and about the origin of the universe. Now, he who wonders and is perplexed feels that he is ignorant, is in a sense a philosopher, since myths are composed of wonders. The passage provides a lens for understanding the transition from the fulgurazione of the first appearance of Dante's life of Beatrice, as described in E Mincresce di Me, to the Meraviglia Beatrice of the Vita Nova. This pattern or progression from wonder to philosophy and or poetry, myth-making, drives and energizes Dante's life, emanating from the point of origin of the appearance of Beatrice in his life and its ramifications throughout his works, the other works, and the Commedia. The progress of Beatrice as a subject of Dante's poetry evolves alongside his development as a cosmological poet, from the epiphany of her first appearance to her leave-taking from Dante to resume her seat in the celestial rose in Paradiso. Indeed, as the poet himself asserts in Paradiso 30, verses 28 through 30, dal primo giorno chi vidi suo viso in questa vita infino a questa vista, non mi è seguire al mio cantar preciso. The way I like to interpret this apparently contradictory statement, contradictory in the light of Purgatory 30, is that in retrospect, Dante recognized that they were all Beatrices, from the Donna Gentile on, to the Pargoletta, to the Donna Petra, and so on. It's little wonder, excuse the pun, the evolution we remarked in the move from poem to libello is characterized by the introduction of cosmology. For Dante, who was at risk of exile, banishment, cosmology was that form of knowledge and theory and practice that served to reestablish and reorient the poet within the framework of the cosmos and the society in which he lived. The transition marks, in fact, Dante's initiation in philosophy and myth-making in the embodied sense intended by Albert the Great, who O'Rourke Boyle notes at the beginning of his Metaphysica viewed wonder as a defect of human nature as defined by an Aristotelian desire for knowledge, and the pursuit of knowledge as the motivation and the means for humans who found themselves in a state of suspension which did not fulfill their nature to achieve dignity as stable and social beings. The socio-political dimension or implications of Albert's perspective must have resonated strongly with Dante. The poet's embodiment of the pursuit of knowledge and of ultimately Aristotelian origin appropriately progressed to raising questions about the changes of the moon and of the sun, about the stars, and about the origin of the universe. Thus, mapping the cosmos and his own place within it also represented a means of establishing a measure of dignity and stability within the Florentine community, including within the arena of Florentine politics. And allow me to abruptly pivot from the foregoing conceptual account to the socio-historical context, and to suggest that the programmatic emergence of cosmology in Dante's works in the Vita Nova that I've highlighted has yet to be considered in relation to Dante's emergence as a political actor on the Florentine stage. Cosmology would have been recognized by Dante's contemporaries as a form of knowledge with civic, political implications, and as an attribute of cultural authority in those who possess it. Indeed, for Albert, no human science came closer to understanding the order of the universe, which also meant the civic order of politics. I should open up parentheses here just to mention that it will be helpful to know more about what was the state of cosmological knowledge in Dante's Florence before the exile and its role in Dante's intellectual formation. This is a topic within the general area of Dante scholarship of the last generation, really dedicated to Dante's intellectual formation, but that's relatively undeveloped in comparison to other themes until recent work by Anna Cesena and some others who have begun to trace more precisely what might have been sources in the Florentine context of Dante's cosmological knowledge. Most recently, Lorenzo Veloso, in a forthcoming study that will be published by La Lighieri, building on Cesena's work, has discovered in lessons given by the Franciscan friar Peter of Trabibus in Santa Croce during the 1290s, Christian Ptolemaic accounts of the role of the movements of the heavens that share some vocabulary and have evident analogies to Dante's position on such questions. In any event, the very special role cosmology played in Dante's very particular, we might say, sui generis strategies of self-authorization vis-a-vis his poetical and political peers in Florence has perhaps been underestimated as a factor in his emergence as a public figure and political actor. And I'd like to suggest that cosmology had important socio-political implications already in the Libello that contributed to the poet's reputation as a socio-political subject emerging within the Florentine environment. It represented an attribute that contributed to his reputation. And I think there's evidence in the Vita Nova to support this claim. I mean, the civic political dimensions, implications of the Libello, of course, are currently the subject of renewed critical interest. I'm thinking of Baranski, Veglio. Some of our students here at Notre Dame have been very interested in this subject. I think cosmology plays a role. Dante, of course, tells us as much in the poem. It's an important, if sometimes overlooked, part of Brunetto Latini's investiture of Dante in Inferno 15 as the heir of his Florentine political legacy and as student who was destined to surpass his teacher. Maraldi has shown, in fact, and this is really interesting, how Brunetto's subsequent fame as Optimus Astrologus actually originates with the Dante commentators as a kind of reverse ricochet effect of the Fortuna of Dante's cosmological poem. There's even a story reported by commentators, including Jacopo della Lana, Benvenuto, Anonimo Fiorentino, Daniello, that Brunetto did Dante's horoscope. In fact, the substance of Brunetto's actual involvement with cosmology didn't really go much beyond what you would have expected of an encyclopedist of his ilk. But Dante, who had already, before the death of Brunetto, made and would continue to invest in developing his reputation in the field, is careful to put into Brunetto's mouth the horoscope that Dante himself had cast at the start of the libello. E egli a me, se tu segui tua stella, non puoi fallire a glorioso porto, sei ben m'accorsi nella vita bella. E se io non fossi sì per tempo morto, veggendo il cielo a te così benigno, dato t'avrei all'opera conforto. Dante gives his teacher the task of pronouncing a propitious horoscope for his pupil, who's exhorted to follow and to realize the inclinations of the heavens and the achievement of a glorious port granted by destiny. Qual fortuna o destino qua giù ti mena. Dante, of course, is at some pains to distance himself from Brunetto, also in his treatment of Brunetto's astrological prognoses. He critiques them implicitly as excessively materialistic and deterministic. It was not astrological destiny or fortune that was responsible for Dante's journey to the afterlife, which is part of a more generalized overwriting and surpassing of the secular, humanistic, political magistero of Brunetto. And in fact, as Maraldi has noted, Dante accoglie positivamente le teorie astrologiche del tempo, ma ridimensiona la portata a favore del provvidenzialismo e del libero arbitrio, conciliando astrologia e fede cristiana. No doubt. Nonetheless, for our purposes, the astrological theme of the encounter between Dante and Brunetto's awareness of the favorable astrological auspices of Dante's birth suggests that this aspect was early a part of Dante's reputation and considered a positively connoted attribute at the time of his entrance into the political life of the commune during the first half of the last decade of the 13th century. In 1294, the year that Brunetto died, what got Dante invited to the welcome to Florence party of Charles Martel? Sant'Agata, among others, imagines Dante recited some of his poetry after dinner, perhaps even the canzone, Voi contendendo il terzo cielo movete, whose incipit Charles cites upon re-encountering Dante in the heaven of Venus. Probably already composed by 1293-94, Dante wrote a commentary on that poem in the second book of the Convivio, and the commentary features a memorable, substantial excursus in the manner of the digressions of that work on the influence of the planets and their movers, and an analogy between the nine heavens and sciences. As Durling Martinez note in their commentary, the relationship between this commentary on the influence of the planets and their movers, in which Dante basically sketches a map of the heavens of the future Paradiso. The connection between this commentary and Paradiso 8, say Durling Martinez, has not been sufficiently investigated. And I think their assessment is still accurate. Leaving that investigation for later, it's uncontroversial to assert that Dante's poetry would have been the foundation for the reputation he had in Florence when he came into contact with the Angevin prince. But what features of that poetic reputation in particular, and which of these would have had particular political implications, seems reasonable to suggest that an important part of his reputation was connected to his authority as a cosmological poet, which would explain the specific treatment of the cosmological theme in Paradiso 8, where the renewed encounter with the Angevin prince inspires one of the most important passages dedicated to the poet's cosmological theories. Indeed, there is a cosmological genealogy to the episode that goes back via the Donna Gentile to the cosmological setting of the Vita Nova. In Paradiso 8, 94 through 136, Dante puts in the mouth of the Angevin prince a full-blown discussion of cosmological theory in which the influence of the heavens, that is the planets and the fixed stars, on the development of the human fetus is said to be stronger than heredity. Lo ben che tutto il regno che tu scandi volge e contenta fa esser virtute sua provvidenza in questi corpi grandi, e non pur le nature provvedute sono in la mente che da sé perfetta, ma esse insieme con la lor salute, perché quantunque quest'arco saetta disposto cade e ha provveduto fine, sì come cosa in suo segno diretta. Providence had ordered this arrangement to override heredity in order to meet the needs of human civil society. The influence of the heavens for Dante was one of the most fundamental and powerful instruments of God's government of the world. His cosmological theory and practice having come a long way here since the Vita Nova. There'd been the Petrose, the later Rime, especially Tre Donne, the Montanina, Convivio dei Vulgari along the way. The cosmological line of development was continuous and sustained up to the Commedia, to say nothing of the major tributaries of cosmological theory and practice present in those works, written to bolster and support the project of the poem in progress, Monarchia, the Quaestio, and the Eclogue. Dante's reputation when he met Charles in 1294 in Florence would have been characterized by not just a propitious personal horoscope, by a knowledge of astrology that would form the foundation of the poet's emerging political theology. This reputation need not have depended on the canzone Voi che vendendo il terzo ciel movete, which might not have even been written, as Giunta has pointed out, by the time Dante met Charles in 1294. But Dante's reputation as Optimus Astrologos went back to the publication of the Vita Nova. An important part of his reputation and authority as he entered upon the political life following the death of Brunetto Latini was for cosmological knowledge, a cultural attribute that he had self-consciously developed in the Vita Nova as part of a broader self-authorizing strategy vis-a-vis the Florentine civic, political, and poetic community at the time of the composition of the libello. And that while this attribute might or might not have gotten him invited to the party for Charles, the astro-cosmological content of the encounter with the Angevin prince in Paradiso 8 that is so central to the cosmology of the poem traced its origins to the original cosmological reframing and contextualization of the event of the first appearance of Beatrice in Dante's life, a disorienting, traumatic experience that was stabilized at the start of the libello in the Albertan sense, that viewed the pursuit of knowledge as a response to the experience of wonder as the basis for the individual's initiation into philosophy and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. That was wonderful. Thank you. That was really, really, really excellent. Now, we're going to have time for a few questions. So while everybody's formulating their very best question, I will ask the kind of more generalized one, if I may. I mean, thank you for that excursus on the cosmological, cartographic reframing, especially of the Vita Nuova. I thought it was fascinating. But as you go through that, I mean, my understanding of Rumb lines is that there is this kind of, they're spiral, there's a constant bearing towards this true north. So there's a pattern to them at all times. And I'm wondering though, in Dante, this mappatura that you are involved in, are there different types of maps in the sense of, between the cosmological, the toponymical, the topographical, where, and indeed the kind of uncharted as well? Have you noticed that throughout his work?
Yeah, thank you, Dara, for that. I think the I think Dante's very well aware of the cartographical revolution that's going on around him, which is basically the beginnings of, well, actually from the beginning of the Duecento, of empirical nautical maps of the Mediterranean, like Pietro Visconti's maps that are going to lead to the first map of Italy, the earliest and unbelievably accurate mappings of the Mediterranean world, which is a step beyond the Mappa Mundi. There's also there's basically the Mappa Mundi, the Mediterranean maps, and then I think that Dante develops all of these in the poem. And more importantly, I think his poetry expresses a cartographic impulse, which is characteristic of his age. So that if you think about the poem, it's full of maps. It's full of very detailed, every canticle has a distinctive cartographic program, really. And so what I'm trying to do, to answer your question, is bring cartography into the cosmological picture. I mean, we've always talked about Dante's stars. There's been a lot of very important work on astrology and cosmos in Dante's intellectual formation, Dante's literature. But I think the mapping impulse in the cartographic sense is coming together with the cosmological. I mean, they actually are part of the same whole. And so I think that's, one of the things I'm trying to bring out in this work is using that as, it's also a conceit, as you can tell from the outline that I gave of the chapters. There's not, Rumb lines that we talk about today are not the same as the Rumb lines in the nautical charts. However, for my money, Dante is a lot closer to Petrarch and Boccaccio than people understand him to be in terms of his connectivity to the revolution in cartography that was going on around him. All you need to think of is the Ulysses episode as an example of, he's in a period of transition in the history of space. We're on the cusp of the Atlantic discoveries, of the Canaries, of the New World. Dante's channeling all that. He's very aware of that. And his cartographics of the self represent a new technique or a new technology from a poetic and literary point of view that he's developing already in the Rime. Tre Rime, there's a map of the Nile, the sources of the Nile. And then he really revs it up after the exile in the De Vulgaria Eloquentia, where Italy becomes, that's a principal framework within which he wants to situate himself and transcend the disunity of Italy in order to provide a perspective that, again, he maps it, in that beautiful chapter in the De Vulgaria Eloquentia where he says, I've read all of the descriptions of the world and the cosmographers, and I've also studied the orbits of the Earth and the cosmos, and I've, on the basis of that mapping, achieved a new perspective, achieved a perspective that transcends the perspective of a Florentine or the perspective of an exiled person. It's a way of compensating, as we know from our reading of the De Vulgaria Eloquentia, that that's what it's about. He's transcending the exile through a project of mapping Italy. Mapping Italy is fundamental to that. I'm sorry, I kind of went in.
No, that's fantastic. By the way, thanks a million for cartographics of the self, because I've just written that down. It's wonderful. And presumably also kind of imposing an order on that as well. I see now there are a number of questions. So I can see, Christina, your hand is up.
Yes, hi Ted. That was marvelous. What a far-reaching project. So I also really like the idea of the cartographies of the self, or the cartographics of the self, I would say. And the one thing that I was thinking of in your talk when you transitioned to the socio-political dimension of sort of how we can tie this into that, the verse that has always resonated strongly with me in that regard is when, of course, he's in the heaven of the fixed stars, when he's in Gemini and he looks down and he sees the whole earth, l'aiuola che ci fa tanto feroci, and this amazing moment where we know what he's thinking is political. At least I think the assumption, right? Why else would we be so feroci if not for the strife that has been caused within the political and the personal arena within society, and that experience sort of distills the entire globe, right, into this, what has been translated as the threshing floor. But this amazing moment where you would think that, the perspective that's afforded by being so far away would in fact not make it be in Iola anymore, or that would somehow, in our way, you would think that there'd be sort of rose-colored glasses that one would adopt when you're up in the heavens looking down on earth. And yet he doesn't forget exactly what it is that happens on earth. The incredible proximity between someone in the fixed stars looking down on earth, to me, has always just been one of the most striking verses of the poem. So I hear what you're saying about bringing this together and how he's using cartography in a way to orient himself, but to describe sort of a different type of psychology of the self that is in both local and larger universal terms, right? To chart it out, to map it out in this very objective way. So I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you. That's a great comment. I guess my point is he's headed to the heaven of Gemini from the beginning. That's a trajectory that is foreordained. That's his Rumb. That's one of his Rumb lines that is as Christian Jacob says, expresses the promise of attaining the destination. I love your comment about of course, that's the dream of Scipio that Dante is rewriting in the heaven of Gemini. And it's interesting that if I'm not mistaken, the Aiuola would represent one of the threshing floor is, which he repeats, it's like an obsession, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I have to go and check, but Simone will know, it distinguishes Dante from the dream of Scipio. I mean, the dream of Scipio is about the distance and the smallness of the world, but Dante's got that, like you're saying, he's got that bite in it. He's still looking back at that world, and it's a mess. So I don't know if that thank you for that comment and that suggestion.
Simone, did you want to come in on that?
Well, not to answer Ted's question about whether Dante is actually undoing the dream of Scipio or not, but actually I have a follow-up, I think, on Christina's question. So I apologize if I jump, if I skip a line for a moment. So my follow-up is, I'm really intrigued, Ted, by your talk, and especially by these, the political aspect of it. I think Paradiso 8, that you can get a lot of mileage out of that idea. I have a question, really sort of a philosophical question on maps of the heavens and maps of the earth. They seem to be talking about describing distinctness of two really different kinds. I mean, the map of the earth is based on distinctness of space, whereas the map of the heavens is distinctness of time. So you're doing wonderful and possibly convincing work of bridging time and space, but already in Vita Nuova, where Florence is, whatever the city is elided, at least by name. I mean, knowledge of horoscopes, does it really depend on place, or is it really a question mostly and substantially of time? So I'm really intrigued, and I'm willing to be convinced. But I wonder, what to do of the silence that Dante tends to keep on space, at least in Vita Nuova. Then it will explode. I agree with you. It explodes, once the question is exile.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting. I'm going to have to work hard to convince you, Simone. I think that's where I was alluding to some of the new work that's trying to find in the Vita Nuova a political community or a political issue that's going on there. So, for example, even at the end of Chiara's Bordoni's written an interesting chapter in a book that is I hope will appear on the last chapters of the Vita Nuova as the beginning of a kind of there is a spatiality there where he talks about the pilgrimage and the pilgrimage routes. It's almost like an early mapping mapping program is already emerging at the end of the Vita Nuova. And I think it relates to that part of the Vita Nuova where the Beatrice is going to become a subject of interest beyond Florence, right? And I think that's also in chapter 29, Simone, when he talks about the 9 heavens, and he says it's in this tradition and this other tradition and this other tradition. I think we're talking about Dante spatializing beyond the city. And also, I'm with De Robertis on I Principi della Terra when he says, I wrote letters to the princes of the land. I don't think he's talking about the top important people in Florence. I mean, to me, it's a biblical allusion, which is suggesting that this is of interest beyond Florence. So I think there's more to learn about the spatiality, also in terms of the political implications of Beatrice herself, already in the Vita Nuova. I mean, I think Veglio's essays are, like, they're kind of like what you're saying about me, not completely convincing, but really interesting, on this point. And so I think there's something to do there. Now, what I'm arguing though for is that the book itself, okay, I think that the spatialization of Dante author within the verticality of Donne che avete intelletto d'amore, within the map of the 9 heavens, which are going to be transcended at the end of the book into the Empyrean. I think the spatiality of that derives from Dante's sense of having to map himself. And it's not a question so much of, I mean, it is a question of intellectual history, but it's also, it's an authorial gesture of self-mapping. Okay, thank you. Thank you for, let's keep talking about it, please.
I have a question. So Leila Livragi's internet connection isn't great, so she's asked me to read out this question from the chat. She says, thank you, Ted. I was wondering if you are including authors like Solino in your work. I've recently linked the mention of the Elitropia in Inferno 24 to Solino's Discutio Mundi, and I'm curious if you are personally working on this author and him as a cartographic encyclopedic source of Dante, or in general, you know more about this subject.
That's a great question. I'd love to learn more from Leila about that. I think that the Dante's sources, there's been certainly Solinus and many others are at play, and it wouldn't surprise me. It would not surprise me at all to find, that these also change. I mean, he would be among those authors that Dante alludes to in the De Vulgari Eloquentia as his authorities for, like Orosius and others, for acquiring a basic knowledge of terrestrial and cosmographic mapping, cosmographic knowledge. But I'd love to, Leila, I'd love to see the essay that you're talking about. It would be very helpful to me.
Okay, we have a question also from Julia.
The Vita Nova is just very close to the time when Jerusalem, the last part of the Jerusalem kingdom, is lost, when Acre falls and the Crusaders. So in a sense, that means that you've lost the center of what pilgrimage was, and which leaves a vacuum in which Dante perhaps is sort of shaping Beatrice as Christ, Florence as Jerusalem. But then with Corso Donati and the blacks and the whites and his exile, that doesn't make sense any longer. Eugenio Gianni with the Regione Toscana has published my edition of Brunetto's writings. And what I've done is 2 volumes. And the first volume is of the manuscripts where Brunetto was dictating to his students, who traditionally were Guido, Dante, and Francesca da Barberina. And there are 2 manuscripts of the Tesoro, where at the end, he's calculating what the moon phases will be in 1298. And Carlo Martel and Dante are together in 1294 in Florence. And the other manuscript, which I identify, think these 2 that I'm talking about, and also the Tesoretto, possibly are in Dante's hand. But there's another manuscript which is not in Dante's hand of the Tesoro, with all of the astronomical designs, which don't get published in the printed editions of the Tesoro, but which I have now been able to publish. And in that one, there is a horoscope. So I am seeing this aspect of, the computations, the cosmological computations going on in the schoolroom, as it were. The other thing I love is Vittorio Alinari's photographs of the real places that Dante mentions. And I have put these with the text, hypertext of the Commedia that I have on the web, along with the music and along with the manuscript illuminations, to try to give a fuller version, visual, audio, etc., of the Commedia for students and so on, along with the readings. Forgive me for talking so long. I loved your talk.
Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you. Fascinating. Congratulations on your publications of the Brunetto.
He is amazing.
And others.
Okay, we have a question here from Carol.
Hi there. Hi, Ted. Thank you so much for this talk. How's it?
Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you as well. And I'm really tickled to see. I mean, I know that these are things you've been thinking on for some time. And so it's really wonderful to see how this is coming to fruition in really intriguing ways. So I have sort of a 2-part question for you. On the one hand, I'm wondering sort of how you might distinguish Dante from other sort of cartographical writing, let's say, whether it be on one end, thinking of him maybe as being bookended by like Restauro d'Arezzo on one end and Cecco d'Ascoli on the other, right? These 2 different kinds of models, and thinking about sort of moving across. So that is where the heavens go in, where the heavens influence, whether it be the earth, which is Restauro d'Arezzo's kind of geological exploration, or the body, which is more Cecco d'Ascoli's focus. So thinking about those influences, and I'm wondering if that might be sort of a productive way of going in there, because the other part to this that kind of I struggle with is that we're talking about, in a way, a poetic representation of something that we see as being inherently visual, right? And when you speak of Rumb lines, I immediately go to the portolans. I immediately think of, I start thinking in very visual terms. And so I'm wondering how might that writing, that sort of either encyclopedic or cosmological writing, be incorporated, because for example, the commentaries on Grosseteste's Sphera actually had illustrations, right? They did have a visual element. So it's like, how do you bridge that from the textual to the visual in a way that has sort of a material anchor? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, part of the answer is that the way that all readers have responded to Dante's text by making maps. I mean, I mentioned I'm teaching the Purgatorio now, and what's interesting about the Anti-Purgatorio, but this is true of the Inferno too, is that he challenges the readers to make a map. You cannot read the Divine Comedy without making a map to figure out not only where he is, but where you are. I mean, in terms of your reading. So I think that, from that perspective, cartography is also a reading strategy or reader's model. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about Cecco-d'Ascoli and Ristoro. I think I kind of put them in the category of that's cosmography that Dante's certainly Ristoro d'Arezzo he's aware of, and he's contemporary to. But for what I'm talking about, I'm looking at Dante much more in the direction of Petrarch and Boccaccio. I got this idea. I started thinking about this when I read Tom Conley's book called The Self-Made Map. It's about French Renaissance authorship in the period of print. And it's a very interesting book. And he makes a point that the authors are actually mapping themselves, that it becomes a part of their textuality as they're positioning themselves within textual space, but as a means of spatializing themselves within their cultural matrix, so to speak. And I remember when I first read that years ago, I thought, well, Petrarch was already doing this, obviously, Petrarch and Boccaccio, and Dante is too. I think he masks, he's a little less, he's harder to get your hands, because he's not as confessional as Petrarch. It's not as obvious as in Petrarch that's what it's about, that he's trying to just overcome his sense of alienation by mapping himself. With Petrarch, it's like a psychological crutch almost. Whereas with Dante, he turns it into a real cosmology that coheres at one level. But when you get down to it, the Ristoro d'Arezzo and all those cosmological and also the mapping paragraphs and parts of the Commedia, it's like a subgenre of cartographic and cosmological writing within the poem that he's absorbed from these authors that you're talking about. But again, to me, the distinctive characteristic of Dante's implementation of all this is that it's a self-made man. It's about him, ultimately it's dealing with his problem of, which is of course a universalized problem of exile, which he masterfully turns into a universal work of literature. But when you come right down to it, I think there is this self-mapping inspiration at the core and at the origin.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions there before we wrap up this evening? This is your last chance. Don't be shy. No. Okay. Well, before we let off the hook completely, I just want to remind you about next week's lecture. For those of you who tuned in earlier this evening, you will have heard me say that the last time we actually had someone physically in UCC giving one of our Dante lectures was Catherine Keane before the pandemic struck. I'm delighted to announce that hopefully next week John Barnes is going to make it down from Dublin on the train, and he's going to we're going to experiment with a hybrid event to see is this possible and how it'll work. So John is going to give and John will be known to all of you really. He's a wonderful dentist, and you know, he really has led the way for Dante studies in Ireland for the past few decades. And the title of John's lecture next week is "I've Got a Little List, an approach to Dante's catalogue." So that will be a fascinating one. So same time, same place, same link with the Zoom. So do please tune in. I know for our friends across the ocean, you know, it is just after lunch and the postprandial slump can kick in. But I think after what we heard for us this evening, anyone who was thinking to have a little snooze this afternoon, that was not the case. That was the most wonderful lecture, Ted, and I am so grateful to you. And thank you so much for just really enriching the series and giving what was a really splendid lecture. So thank you.
You're too kind. Thank you all. It's great to see everyone. Bye-bye.
I'm now going to stop the recording.